Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 92. I'm talking to Phil Zimmermann, who is the creator of the pretty good privacy protocol for email to encrypt your email. He's long worked with encryption, and he's long been an advocate of privacy and privacy on the internet. How are you, Phil?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Yeah. Tell me, how did you get started in all this? I mean, you've been programming and doing stuff like that since when? Maybe the 70s or even earlier than that?
Well, I've been a software engineer since the 70s, but I was specializing in cryptography starting in the 90s.
Yeah, just when the internet came on. Just curious, when did you first get on the internet?
Well, at first I was using bulletin board systems.
Oh yes, bulletin board systems. Yeah.
And so that wasn't exactly the internet.
Yeah.
That's where you just use an acoustic modem to dial into a bulletin board system from using your PC through a serial cable.
Yes, exactly. Maybe what
protocols like X modem and Z modem, and
yeah.
In fact, the original release of PGP was done. The target environment was bulletin board systems. I mean, it was also useful for the internet, but the first use of it was on bulletin board systems.
Yeah, I was never on bulletin board systems, unfortunately, so I wasn't really familiar with that. I know you use like maybe a 3000 BPS modem or something like that at the time.
Yeah, I think I had a 1200 baud modem when I did this in the first release.
Yeah. And of course, the fastest modems ever got to were 56,000, which was, of course, limited by the performance of the phone lines. And then we went to broadband. So you developed PGP to encrypt email, and you wrote a guide to PGP and a few other books. And so what inspired your interest in encryption?
Well, I've always been interested in encryption. When I was 10 years old, I read a children's book on secret codes, codes and secret writings. And so that was things like substitution codes and transposition codes, and how to make invisible ink out of lemon juice, stuff like that. But a kid who's 10 years old is, it's kind of a fun thing. But when I started as a university student in 1972, my first programming language was BASIC, and so I wrote a program in BASIC that used the built-in random number generator that BASIC had to add random numbers to each letter of a message, and then the output of that looks pretty random. And then when you send that elsewhere, and you then use the same random number generator to subtract the same random numbers from the encrypted message, and that restores it to the original message. Now, I thought that was a pretty clever way to do things, because when I was a kid, the way in which I learned that you could break things with doing frequency analysis. So the most common letter is supposed to be the letter E, and the second most common letter is T, and the third one is A. And so if you study the frequency of the letters, you can reconstruct the original message. But that becomes much harder if you shift each letter by a random amount. That was the seeming brilliance of using a random number generator. But it turns out that the output of a random number generator in BASIC is not very random. I thought it was random. They claim it's random, but it's not as random as you might think. And so years later, I discovered that that's pretty easy to break. But at the time, that was my first stab at, trying to encrypt things with a computer.
Wow, that's pretty wild. Yeah. So when did you first get onto email?
Well, it was during the development of PGP. And I had an email account at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. I lived in Boulder. And so I used that email service to communicate to other people. And so I sent the original release of PGP to a couple of friends who then sent it on Usenet news groups and BBSs.
Yes. And of course, this was when back in the days when email was just nothing but text as well.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you'd use those command line email clients and things like that. They didn't really have graphical interfaces.
I was using an email the client. Well, I don't know. It's running on a server. I'm logged in. I was logged into a server through a terminal emulator actually, and then I was using Elm, which is at that time was what people often used for email processing.
Yeah, you were probably using some version of Linux then, weren't you?
Well, I was dialing up. With, I think I was using Telnet to dial up a remote server, and I was somehow using Elm to talk to it.
Okay, yes.
And Linux was not out yet. Linux came out at about the same time as PGP.
Okay. Yeah, PGP. So that's
I think both of them came out around 1991.
Yeah. Yeah, PGP. Yeah, PGP. Yeah, and was that the first attempt to do this, or did people try it beforehand?
What, to have an email encryption software?
Yes.
Well, I know that there was a commercial product from RSA Data Security, and I don't remember the name of it, but it used 56-bit DES for encryption, and it used RSA. But it was also an expensive commercial software package, and I don't think they had a large population. And I didn't like it because it had 56-bit DES as its encryption algorithm. Now, it turns out that my encryption algorithm for PGP version 1 was also not a very good encryption algorithm. I called it the Bassomatic, and it was a homegrown encryption algorithm. And at that time, I was too stupid to understand that it's a bad idea to do a homegrown algorithm. Software engineers, especially good software engineers who, have years of experience writing good software, they have the confidence to think that they can develop an encryption algorithm. And that's a terrible mistake to make, because, being a good software engineer does not really help you understand how to make a good encryption algorithm. The only way that you can have a good encryption algorithm is if you take advantage of the years or decades of arms race that went on between cryptographers and cryptanalysts. I wasn't part of that arms race, and so I was developing it from scratch, and that's a terrible way to do it. And I didn't understand that at the time. I was naive.
Yeah. But
the first time I showed this encryption algorithm, the Bassomatic, to a real cryptanalyst was at the Crypto 91 event at the International Association for Cryptologic Research. And there I ran into Adi Shamir and Ellie Beam. Ellie Beam had just gotten his PhD in cryptanalysis of breaking the DES, the data encryption standard. And so I showed him my algorithm, and within a few minutes, it took me like 10 minutes to explain it to him, and he took about 2 minutes to break it. And so that was, that was a humbling experience. And that's what, that helped me understand that I wasn't a real cryptographer, which actually that made me a better cryptographer.
Yeah. Did any particular event inspire your interest in privacy issues? Because you did this 10 years before the Patriot Act.
Yeah. During the 1980s, I was politically active in trying to stop the arms race. I was working on the nuclear weapons freeze campaign to try to get the U.S. and the Soviet Union to get them to stop building nuclear weapons. And so in trying to organize that, that there was a lot of tension between the White House and activists who were trying to stop the arms race. The Reagan White House took the position that we were Soviet puppets, which wasn't true. I mean, I certainly didn't feel like a Soviet puppet. And so I felt that grassroots political organizations in the United States needed protection from their own government. And so I wanted to write software to do this, but I was too busy with my activism to divert my attention to sitting down and writing this software. But I was starting the early designs of it in around the middle of the 80s. And then by the end of the 80s, I had a lot of the components in place. And I started working on, in 1990, I started working on putting them all together into a single piece of software that could encrypt and decrypt and generate keys. And it took about 6 months. And I missed 5 mortgage payments. And then in June of 91, I released PGP version 1. I didn't finish everything I wanted, but I had to let it out because I couldn't miss any more mortgage payments. So version 1 didn't have quite all the functionality I wanted. I released the version 15 months later.
Yes, and PGP means pretty good privacy. Did PGP help you catch up on those mortgage payments? Did it bring in a lot of income or not?
In the long run, it did. It didn't right away. I turned my attention back to my consulting work, which was how I paid the bills.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway,
but after PGP became well known, it was easier to get consulting work.
Oh yes. So that seems to be a model. You give away the product, but then you sell the service.
Yeah,
service with it. So the product helps get your service because you obviously have the knowledge. So really, going from that time through the 90s, what did you see as far as the growth of the surveillance state and other things like that, even before the World Trade Center? Although the World Trade Center made things worse.
Yeah. Well, I knew that intel agencies intercepted a lot of our communications, and that we needed to have strong encryption to protect against that, not just against the NSA, but against other foreign intelligence agencies.
Yes,
the Soviets. Well, the Soviet Union was collapsing at that time in 1991. And at least the Russians, the successor, and the Chinese, and the Western European democracies, they all had intel agencies that did interceptions. And I just thought that grassroots political organizations, activists, human rights activists, they needed some tools to protect them from their own governments.
Yes.
So PGP was originally a human rights project.
Yeah.
But then after, as the decade of the 1990s progressed, the Cold War was ending, and
Yes.
globalization was taking off. Um, and so, I mean, it used to be that there was a certain amount of globalization for very large companies, giant oil companies, or
Yeah.
companies that operated overseas. But with the end of the Cold War, lots and lots of companies, even smaller companies, could engage in globalization. And that
Yeah.
means hiring people in cheap labor markets. And those cheap labor markets were often in countries that had a history during the Cold War of being authoritarian governments. And so they were surveillance societies, for decades before that.
Yes.
And um, so companies that wanted to follow the globalization path found themselves operating in hostile signals intelligence environments. And so they started to need PGP. Now, what's interesting is that PGP, the initial design of PGP, was different from the initial design of other commercial encryption software because, in 1991, the commercial encryption software only needed to protect companies from their competitors. And their competitors did not have any significant cryptanalytic capabilities. So 56-bit DES was okay. But they didn't necessarily have to protect against intelligence agencies. But as globalization started to take hold, American companies, were operating in environments where they did have to worry about intel agencies intercepting their communications, even friendly ones. I mean, when Disney opened up Disneyland in France, their negotiating position with the French was affected by the French intercepting their communications with their headquarters in the U.S. And so, even allies use their intel agencies to give their domestic companies an advantage. Um, and so, what happened is that over the course of the 90s, as globalization started to really take off, um, the business need for PGP grew more and more, and their threat model more closely resembled the original threat model, which was to protect the user from intel agencies.
Yeah.
The original threat model was for individuals, human rights workers, things like that, and they were up against the national technical means of intel agencies. And so that started to be the same threat model that companies were facing as they progressed through the decade of the 90s in globalization. And so PGP became attractive as a commercial product, but I could not make it turn into a real commercial product until I got past the criminal investigation.
Oh.
So in 1990, in 1993, in early 1993, I was contacted by U.S. Customs and learned that I was the target of a criminal investigation because they thought that I had violated the Arms Export Control Act by exporting a munition. At that time, strong encryption software was regarded to be a munition, just as if I was exporting Stinger missiles. The Arms Export Control Act was the law that I appeared to be breaking. So if I exported Stinger missiles to Libya, I would be prosecuted under the same law as the one that I was almost prosecuted by.
And you probably didn't have much, and you can't really have much control over where something like this goes. I mean,
Yeah, that's how it is on the internet. You release something on the internet, and it just goes everywhere.
Yeah. Or back in those days, you put PGP on a floppy disk, and then somebody hands that floppy disk off to somebody else, and then they hand it off to somebody else, and they make
Yeah.
copies, and then they hand it off to somebody else, and then
There's all
you never know where it's
ways
going.
that you can spread.
Yeah, you know,
Bulletin board systems had international connections, and Usenet news groups did too, and it spread everywhere. And in fact, it was spread quickly because it was an attractive thing. Everybody wanted some.
yeah.
And so the
Yeah.
government took the position that this was the same as an export. It was a violation of the Arms Export Control Act.
Yes.
Now, that particular law, if I were indicted and we went to trial and if I was convicted, the federal mandatory sentencing guidelines are 41 months to 51 months in the federal prison. And so that's what they were threatening me with.
And how can something be considered a weapon when it really has no offensive uses, correct?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because
it's like a bulletproof vest doesn't have an offensive use.
Yeah, I know. When you look at it in a casual inspection of it, does appear to lead to that conclusion. But the real history of warfare elevates the importance of cryptography and cryptanalysis, and it's more complicated than that. So, going back to World War II, the Allies were able to break the encryption algorithms of Germany, the Enigma cipher being the most well known. The Japanese had their ciphers too, the purple cipher. And there were important things that happened in World War II as a result of our ability to break the secret encryption algorithms of our enemies. Bletchley Park is where they did a lot of that work. Perhaps you saw the film The Imitation Game. It tells the story of Alan Turing at Bletchley Park and how they broke Enigma. While the historical accuracy of that film does contain a number of errors, the general idea is, that it played such an important role in the outcome of the war. It shortened the war by a couple of years, saved millions of lives, that we were able to read the German traffic. And we were also able to read the Japanese traffic. The Battle of Midway was a decisive victory for U.S. naval forces. The Japanese lost multiple aircraft carriers there because we were able to decrypt their traffic, and they didn't know we could do this. And so millions of lives were saved, and the war was shortened by a couple of years because of our capabilities to do this. And so our government and the governments of our allies developed an appreciation of the importance of our ability to break our enemies' encryption algorithms. And so it was important to them that our future adversaries not have strong encryption algorithms because because of the experience of World War II. And so they made it illegal to export strong encryption. This was a mentality that they developed in World War II. Perhaps even before then, the Zimmermann telegram in World War I was an example of where cryptanalysis of an encrypted German message affected the outcome of the war dramatically. And so as the decades rolled by after World War II, a few decades later, the internet came along. And before the internet came along, most people didn't have any strong encryption. And so the government felt that they were in a good position. They had a good solid grip on expertise in cryptography. But when the internet came along, it became clear that there was a need for everyone to have strong encryption, to do e-commerce, to shift our lives into the digital realm. And today, so much of our lives are in the digital world. We talk instead of talking on the phone, we talk on, Apple FaceTime or whatever, we talk over the internet like we're doing right now.
Yeah, and we can both remember there was a time when a long distance phone call was a big deal.
Oh yeah, when I was working on PGP, I had volunteers working with me in Europe. In the After the initial release, a lot of volunteers signed up, and I had volunteers in several European countries, um, and New Zealand even. And so I talked with them over phone lines, just ordinary phone lines. And I remember one month my phone bill was $800. This was like
Oh
in
yeah.
1992, you know.
Oh wow. Yeah.
$800 in 1992 was a lot of money for 1 month of talking. So,
Exactly.
um, today, we order things from Amazon, we do online banking, we do all kinds of, we do VPNs, we do um, web browsing, we have all kinds of things that go on the internet that our economy depends on. And so the need is strong for ordinary people to have access to strong cryptography once the internet came along. And so it was necessary for the government to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that it was necessary to reprioritize their concerns and stop trying to prevent everyone from getting strong cryptography. World War II was over. The internet was here. So we had to fight it out for the whole decade of the 1990s. In my case, I had to fight them for 3 years to get them to drop their case against me, which they did in early 1996. But it still took the rest of the decade to get them to change the laws. The US had export controls, but they didn't have any domestic controls. But the FBI was attempting to impose domestic controls with the Clipper chip. We could talk about that later. But the French had domestic controls. The British had a little of both. And it was necessary for all of these governments to just stop trying to control cryptography if they want to enjoy the fruits of the economic boom of the internet.
Yep. The boom of the internet. So how this all lead up? How this lead up to for example, you getting into activism, and for example, you said that they were preparing a lot of things with the Patriot Act before the Patriot Act passed.
Oh yeah.
Who were doing that.
Well, yeah. I was interested in secure voice. I'm best known for my work in secure email with PGP.
Yes.
I was really interested in secure telephony before I was interested in secure email, but nobody had broadband, in at the beginning of the 90s, and so I had to go after the low hanging fruit. So I went after email encryption first. But later on, just a couple years later, in 1995, I developed some software to encrypt your voice for like making internet phone calls, and that was called PGP Phone. But it was a decade too early because nobody had broadband. If you don't have broadband, it's hard to do decent telephony. I mean, I was doing some telephony through modems, but it's awkward and it's not very fast. These modems, you know, they didn't reliably run fast enough to get high quality voice. So, I had to wait. The product was a decade too early. And then, and so years later, broadband started to come out. And then telephony was, there was an enabling technology for telephony. And so I did secure telephony, but I was holding off after the 9/11 attacks. I was still wanting to do telephony. It was starting to be, broadband was starting to appear, but I thought, well, the government has their hands full right now with Al Qaeda, and so maybe I can just be lazy and just wait a while, just cut them some slack, work on other projects, keep myself busy with other things, do consulting work and this and that. I can wait a little longer. And so I was waiting, and then I was part of a group called the Roundtable for Scientific Communication and National Security, which was organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And there was a guy from the Justice Department that came in and gave us a briefing on the Patriot Act. And he said, he was explaining how they were, all the things they were using the Patriot Act for. And so I asked a question. I said, can you explain why the Justice Department is teaching seminars to their prosecutors on how to use the Patriot Act to prosecute all manner of crime? And he said, yeah, sure. Crime is crime. And so, if the interceptions that we can do under the Patriot Act can be used for criminal prosecutions, then of course we'll do that. And I said, wait a minute. I thought the Patriot Act was something that the social contract between the government and the population was that we needed protection from Al-Qaeda. And so we allowed you to have the Patriot Act because you needed the Patriot Act to protect us from Al-Qaeda. And he said, no, you have it all wrong. We wanted to do these things that were in the Patriot Act for years, but we had to wait for the political opportunity. And 9/11 provided us with that political opportunity. And so we passed the Patriot Act in about 6 weeks after the attacks, and then use it for whatever we want after that. And I was pretty angry because I thought that was already true. That was my suspected reality, but to hear it come out. Now, this guy his name was Viet Dinh, and he was a Justice Department lawyer under the Bush administration. And he was one of the lead authors of the Patriot Act. And so, this is straight from the horse's mouth. And he was the horse, the horse's mouth.
Yes.
Was telling me in no uncertain terms that their motivation for the Patriot Act was that they wanted to pass it much earlier, but they just didn't have the political window of opportunity that the attacks gave them. And so they seized that opportunity, never let a crisis go to waste.
Yes, former Assistant Attorney General. Yes, he was a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of upset at hearing this. I was raising objections to this. They had to tell me to shut up and sit down. But when I heard that, at that moment, I realized that my no more Mr. Nice Guy. I wasn't going to cut him any more slack. I had thought that I'd give it a couple years, let him pursue Al-Qaeda with the tools of the Patriot Act, and I'll just do some consulting work or use my time for other things. But as soon as he told me that, I'm standing there right in the room with him, so I'm hearing it straight from him. Yeah, I said, okay, yeah, no more Mr. Nice Guy. I'm going to work right away on my telephony stuff. And so I started working on my ZRTP protocol in ZPhone, and then later on, I made a commercial company out of it, Silent Circle, and the product is called Silent Phone. But I also had before that ZPhone, and so I did all that because I was motivated to do that by the remarks of Viet Dinh.
Yes, and according to Wikipedia, his family fled the communists in South Vietnam. So
yeah,
it's people who experience at least ran away from a dictatorship and then go somewhere else and try to create one. It's kind of interesting.
Yes, there's irony is not lost on us.
Yeah, what do you think about since then? Like, for example, some of the revelations of Edward Snowden.
A lot of people who work in cryptography and cybersecurity suspected a lot of these things, but Snowden's revelations confirmed what we feared. And in fact, Snowden's revelations went beyond our fears. I mean, we had assumed some of these things, but what he revealed was that it was far more comprehensive and far-reaching than we had previously suspected. And so the cybersecurity community reacted to this by intensifying their efforts to improve our cybersecurity. I mean, a lot of our protocols were not optimized for against this kind of attacks from NSA, and so the standards committees on the IETF, they went to work in beefing up our security protocols. I mean, for example, TLS. TLS used to make it was very easy in the past with TLS to use old, outdated, obsolete protocol variants of TLS, legacy support. But after Snowden, we realized that that offers attack opportunities to the NSA. And so they made improvements to TLS to de-emphasize the legacy part of, supporting the legacy versions of the product and of the protocol, and insisting on the stronger improvements that are much more tight against these kinds of attacks. And there are other protocols besides TLS that were upgraded because of that. And there was a lot of resistance from the phone companies or from companies that were complicit in surveillance to leave the weaknesses in TLS, and everybody felt that no, we're not going to do that. So I think that we all benefited from being able to make improvements. The thing that was so outrageous about what Snowden discovered was the domestic use of NSA against the American population. NSA was created as a foreign intelligence agency. And, we hired them to do certain things for us, like what they're doing today in Ukraine. They're doing a great job in Ukraine. That's what they're created to do. I highly approve of what NSA is doing in Ukraine. I don't approve of them spying on Americans in the US. That's what Snowden revealed. And that's why everybody got upset about, discovering these things about NSA. It was, we didn't expect the NSA to be spying on Americans. Yeah. Historically, NSA, before 9/11, NSA didn't behave that way by and large. They did comprehensive, signals intelligence in all over the world, including European countries that were our allies. They did that. But they, compared to what they did after 9/11, there was relatively little spying on Americans. But 9/11 changed all that, and they started doing a lot of things that were morally questionable. Now, let's do a little comparison here. Think about Bletchley Park in World War II. There were thousands of employees at Bletchley Park in the UK. They were working on breaking Enigma. They were also breaking Japanese traffic. And there were no whistleblowers at Bletchley Park. And the reason why there were no whistleblowers is because everybody who worked there, this is a top secret, facility. The Germans didn't know what we were doing at Bletchley Park. But the reason why there were no whistleblowers is because everyone who worked at Bletchley Park understood the moral clarity of what they were doing. The Luftwaffe was bombing the UK every night. And everybody who worked at Bletchley Park understood that. The German U-boats were sinking all their, aid coming from the US and Canada. They understood the importance of their work. And so no one at Bletchley Park was a whistleblower. In fact, if you go back to, during the Cold War, the NSA, they didn't have whistleblowers during the Cold War because people who worked at NSA felt that they were doing a good thing.
Yes.
But after 9/11, the Bush administration told NSA to change their behavior and do things that were morally, questionable. Yeah. And it's because of that. It's not just Snowden. I mean, Snowden was not the first to be a whistleblower. There were others before him. There was maybe half a dozen before him. And, I think there might have been some after him as well. But the reason why there were whistleblowers is because they looked at what NSA was doing, and it was different and morally questionable. And that's what inspires whistleblowers to speak up. And that's what motivated Snowden. Now, certainly you could have an argument about whether, maybe did Snowden reveal too much? I mean, it wasn't always about domestic surveillance. He revealed some things about, foreign signals intelligence as well. And so that's debatable. You could have intelligent people disagree with whether he went too far. But I think that overall, Snowden did something that I think is morally defensible. And so I respect what he did. I mean, there were others that did other things.
Yeah. I mean, I agree.
WikiLeaks, what's his name? The guy who did WikiLeaks, I forgot his name.
Julian Assange.
Julian Assange, right? Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What happens when you get old? You forget names.
Yeah, definitely. You're not going to have whistleblowers when you have the moral high ground. And I don't know, but it seems like after the World Trade Center, really, I think America gave up trying to have the moral high ground.
Yeah, I think that I think we need an intelligence agency to do signals intelligence around the world. And I mean, what we see right now in Ukraine is a great example of the NSA doing their job. They're providing valuable intelligence to the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian intel, and providing them with targeting information. And I mean, this is what we want them to do. So, it kind of depends on what the White House is telling them to do. If the White House tells them to do morally questionable things, then that's probably what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And so after 9/11, that's what the White House was telling them to do.
Well, it was after that too. Is America never tortured people before that too?
That's right.
It's really evil what's happened. But what's also interesting too, though, is I wonder too if we're going to see more what we call cyber warfare. I mean, you try to hack the other country's electrical grid, or try to hack their financial systems or something like that to figure out other ways to paralyze the country without necessarily dropping bombs.
Yeah. Right now we're seeing cyber warfare has become so much more active. I mean, the electric grid in Ukraine was shut down repeatedly by Russian attacks. And our own American electric grid, we discovered that there were Russian malware embedded in our control systems for our electric grid, just waiting for the command to activate and shut down our electricity in the U.S.
Yeah. And one thing I think was revealed about Snowden too was I think there was a lot of NSA spying on Europeans, and I suppose that
that's true. And it's funny. I don't really feel the same about spying on foreign countries, even allies, because I care a lot more about my own government spying on me than some foreign government spying on me. I mean, for example, if during the Cold War I found out that East Germany was spying on me in California, what could they do? They can't arrest me. They can't.
That's true.
Kick my door in the middle of the night and drag me off to a secret detention cell and torture me in California. When it's your own government doing it, they're using the powerful tools that they develop for spying on other foreign military services or foreign diplomatic traffic or something like that. And that's something that international diplomacy has to settle. We were intercepting phone calls from Angela Merkel. Well, Germany is an important ally. Germany and the U.S. have to sit down and talk and say, they have to work out, how they feel about that. and that's something for them to settle, sovereign state to sovereign state. that's not a civil liberties issue. But it's much, much worse if NSA spies on Americans. And you know, and I think that in the Western democracies in Western Europe, you know, I lived in Western Europe for 7.5 years, up until recently, and you know, they have good democracies over there, and you know, they generally have a more comfortable relationship with their own governments. The citizens do than we have in the U.S. So if the intel agencies in Western democracies in Europe were to spy on their own people, then I think that would be bad. I don't know how much that goes on, but that's a domestic issue for them to settle over there. In the case of the U.S., it is very bad if the NSA spies on Americans.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've definitely got a lot of things going on there. Where do you think we go from here after this? I mean, do you think we're going to? Do you think Snowden will ever be able to come back to America, or, you know?
Well, I don't know. You know, he's living in a terrible place to live right now. You know,
Yeah.
he lives.
Why do you think Putin is gave him a place to live? You know, do you think that's Putin's?
Well, you know, he was kind of stuck there. His American passport was while he was in transit between Hong Kong and Moscow.
Yes.
And so once he landed in Moscow to change airplanes to fly to another country, I think somewhere in South America, he was, you know, he suddenly had no U.S. passport. And so he couldn't move. It's kind of like, you know, it's like that Tom Hanks movie about the guy trapped in the airport. But
yeah.
it's called,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, he couldn't leave Moscow. And so Putin gave him, you know, I think Putin, you know, kind of enjoyed making trouble for the U.S. So, you know, he gave him some kind of asylum for a while.
Well, it would be done, if nothing else, to encourage other whistleblowers like that in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got a safe home here.
But Snowden didn't do it to help the Russians.
Yeah, he didn't do it to help the Russians.
And he didn't carry any of that material with him to Moscow.
Yeah.
He handed that over to journalists in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So he didn't bring that with him to Moscow.
What do you think? Do you think maybe we'll see a lot of a lot of people hacking things like this, or, you know, like people trying to, you know, subvert these systems? I mean, it's very interesting, you know, sometimes when just, you know, one lone hacker can do a lot of damage to.
The way it works these days is that intel agencies attack each other's networks all the time.
Oh yeah.
And it's done by, you know, large teams of people, you know, engineers, you know, drawing salaries. You know, they go to work every day and work all day long, trying to break into the networks of their enemies.
Yeah. You know, what do you think about the possibility of central bank digital currencies?
Central bank digital currencies.
Yeah, well, and other things that might be used to surveil.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen that many good examples of it. I know that's been talked about, but you don't see that many.
Yeah. I think
you know, digital currencies have their appeal. They you know, they have some convenience. And I think the original motivation for creating Bitcoin was good intention. You know, I think the guy who invented it meant well, but as the years have gone by, it's disappointing to see how much things have evolved, where there's so much criminality and fraud and pump and dump and all kinds of things, blackmail, ransomware. You know, and then additional cryptocurrencies, like thousands of different cryptocurrencies popping up that are pump and dump schemes. It's really disheartening. even though the original intention was good intention, it's discouraging to see that it's
Yeah.
so pervasively criminal that it gets harder and harder to defend.
Yeah.
I think that it would be nice to have a digital currency that we can all use, and it has a lot of benefits. You can pay for things instantly. You don't have to worry about the banks being closed for the weekend. There's no latency. You know, the banking fees aren't there. I mean, there is a little bit of fee for the transaction cost depending on the cryptocurrency, but overall, it is quite convenient. And so it is attractive to have that. I mean, there are some people who live in countries where they can't easily bank, in Venezuela, for example. And so, there are some good things about cryptocurrencies. It's just that there seem to be so many bad things that have evolved over the past decade, and it's unfortunate. There's another thing that I'm concerned about, and that is the carbon footprint. Fortunately, Ethereum has moved to it moved away from proof of work and now has proof of stake, and so that's interesting. I don't know if it's secure as proof of work, but let's see what happens.
Yeah. The other thing too,
with proof of stake, if it resists attack for some extended period of time,
yeah.
and that's a good thing. Then we should try to migrate to that. But Bitcoin, of course, uses as much electricity as Argentina.
Yeah. One thing that concerns me too, though, take a look, you and I can remember when you can sit down and work on a computer and it wasn't plugged into anything. Now they seem to move us over to phones, and everything's connected now. And, I don't think phones are as secure as computers. And not to mention, as Edward Snowden just point out, how do you know if your computer is ever really off? I mean, at least 10 years ago, I could pull, if I had to work on a laptop, I could unplug it and pull that battery right out. I knew the laptop was off. But nowadays, you don't even know if your device is ever really off.
Well, there was a time when we used to pull the batteries out of our phones.
Yeah.
We want to go talk to somebody in a room without someone listening. You could always open your phone and take the battery out. Those days are gone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wonder how many of these devices are all just surveilling us, because it seems like to me they all want to.
Well, there are
these devices.
You could feel your phone and see if it feels warm.
Yeah.
If it's warm, then it's probably transmitting stuff.
Yeah, and the fact that it seems like there's a, why do we need computers in all of our devices? Why do we need all these chips in our cars? It seems like that's another way to control. I mean,
oh yeah, Internet of Things.
Yeah, I can't believe anybody uses Alexa, for example. I would never use that in a million years. I think that's nuts.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a good talk. What advice do you have for people on protecting themselves and staying safe in this crazy world we live in, Phil?
Well, disconnect your Alexa and similar products from Google, and don't have those plugged in all the time. Don't pay someone to surveil you.
Yes.
If they want to surveil you, let them break a sweat doing it.
Well, Phil, I don't know if you have anything. I'm also curious. Anything to say about the recent death of Kevin Mitnick?
No, it's too bad. He wasn't old enough to die.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he was probably the most notorious hacker ever, and then he, of course, put on a white hat and became a security consultant. Who better to do that?
It's too bad that he died young.
Yeah, it was too bad. Yeah, well, yeah. I wondered if you'd ever met him. Okay, well, thank you very much, Phil.
I have met him. I've met him a couple of times. One of them was he had a podcast. He interviewed me for a podcast.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've seen him at conferences.
Yeah, well, it's been great talking to Phil. I'm glad you had you on here. I hope everything continues to go well, and you got a couple books out there, and we'll certainly make the world safer for computers. So I'm Chris Baker. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Give it a thumbs up and follow me on Twitter, and check out my Substack and my novel Escape from the Village. And we are out.
All right, Chris, thanks. It's been a pleasure.